I'm Dr. Thomas Cheney, lecturer in space governance within AstrobiologyOU, the Open University's interdisciplinary group focused on addressing the scientific governance and ethical challenges associated with astrobiology. Welcome. While you should be able to see me, and in time our experts, your cameras and microphones are turned off, as is the chat. If you have any questions throughout the event, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of our screen. And we really do want you to ask questions, so please ask them. But I'll come to the specifics of that more in a moment. This is the third in a series of events that are held by AstrobiologyOU, exploring the boundaries of astrobiology. The first event was focused on undisciplined futures, which looked at cosmic entanglements and environmental futures. Our second event focused on inclusion, fairness, and engagement, and considered issues of ethical engagement and knowledge production in astrobiology. Like this event, these were recorded and should be available in due course. This event explores the concept of environmentalism and its applicability to outer space, how it needs to adapt and how this adaptation may change human understanding of and relationship to the Earth environment. And with the climate emergency and the recent COP26, these conversations are of growing importance. We're also becoming increasingly aware of the impact of human activities on the space environment, as the recent Russian anti-satellite weapons test has not so helpfully demonstrated the danger of space debris and the fragility of the orbital environment. Fortunately, astroenvironmentalism, in various guises, is a developing interdisciplinary field, as this event will demonstrate. We will open with a keynote from Andrea Owe, an environmental moral philosopher and research associate at Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. She studies particularly the risks of climate change, environmental degradation, and artificial intelligence, and the long-term opportunities of space expansion. This will then be followed by a panel discussion involving Luke Riesbeck, a space policy and research analyst at Astroscale US, which is developing cross-disciplinary solutions to orbital and sustainability challenges, as well as Chris Newman, a professor of space law at Northumbria University, who has published extensively on the legal and ethical underpinnings of space governance, and I'm proud to have called my PhD supervisor, and Nishant Beniwal, a PhD researcher here at the Open University at our law school, and his project concerns enforcement of climate change obligations in a South Asian context. We will then take questions from the audience, which you can ask in the Q&A box within the Zoom function at the bottom of your screen, or you can send them to stem-communications@open.ac.uk. You can do this throughout the event. You don't need to wait for the end, and we really hope that you do ask plenty of questions. I'm overjoyed that we could get these four brilliant people together to discuss this topic. We're really in for a treat, and so I will now hand over to Andrea. Thank you.
So thanks for the introduction, Thomas. Let me just say a few more words on what it is that I do so that you have a bit of a context. So I'm an environmental moral philosopher, and I work in the cheerfully called field of global catastrophic risk. And essentially this means that my job has two parts. And one is to figure out how we may avoid going extinct, or at least harm to such an extent that life and civilization as we know it might really never recover. So we call the risks of such events global catastrophic risk. And that includes runaway global warming, global ecosystem collapse, some forms of artificial intelligence, nuclear warfare, asteroid impacts, and so on. So as you see, some of these risks are human caused and some of them are natural. And the other major part of my job is to study the moral potential of the long-term future that could be realized if we overcome these risks. So that means thinking quite far into the future, hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of years ahead. And such a future is likely to entail space expansion. So that's one way of getting into thinking about ethics and moral value in space. And as an environmental philosopher, I do that through a lens that really sees moral value across the spectrum of what we call nature. So that's the sort of frameworks that I work with. So today I'm going to do particularly three things in order to show you why environmental thinking is relevant to how we go about space exploration and new activities in space. So first, I want to give you just a brief introduction to environmental ethics and how it can be applied to space. Then I'll tell you a bit about the space discourse as it stands today and its environmental and ethical legacy. And then we'll do a sort of deeper dive into different activities, ideas, and scenarios of what we might do in space from the present until the long-term future. And we'll explore their environmental and ethical dimensions. So we'll spend most time on the box number 3 that you see here. Okay, so first, just a few words on what environmental ethics is really all about. Environmental ethics is about humans' relationship to and valuing of the natural world. And importantly, environmental philosophy more broadly is also concerned with the very nature of the world. So in other words, how it actually is and not only how it should be. So central questions that we work with are such as what is nature and what is the human role within it? What is the value of different natural entities? How should humans treat nature? And as you see in the top box here, many of these questions can actually quite effortlessly be transferred to space. What is nature in space? What is the value of different extraterrestrial entities? How should humans treat the space environments? And what relationship might people develop to extraterrestrial environments if we succeed with settling on other planets? And a core idea in environmental ethics is the rejection of what we call anthropocentrism, which literally means human-centeredness. And anthropocentrism can be understood both in both ontological and ethical terms, which means, both in terms of how the world is and how it should be. So ontological anthropocentrism is the belief that humans are fundamentally distinct from the rest of nature, whereas ethical anthropocentrism is the idea that humans are more important and better than the rest of nature solely on grounds of being human. So simply put, anthropocentrism means that one considers only, or at least humans, to primarily be of intrinsic value, which is of value of its own, whereas everyone and everything else is considered to be only of instrumental value to humans, which means of value to the extent that it benefits or is useful to humans. So environmental ethics typically reject these ideas. First of all, that humans are fundamentally distinct from the rest of nature is also rejected by modern science. Like there's no human and non-human world, there's one ecosphere. Humans are part of ecosystems and the animal kingdom. And there are many ways to ethically reject anthropocentrism, but they have in common the view that we have no good reasons really to reject intrinsic value in any and all non-human beings and entities. And all in all, anthropocentrism is to a large extent seen as really being at the heart of human mistreatment of nature. And in my opinion, it's a bit of a modern illusion. It makes humans behave in ways that destroy our own home, other living beings, and ultimately ourselves. And as mentioned, I work with global catastrophic risks, of which the most urgent one, in my opinion, is the environmental situation that we're currently in. So in other words, how humans value nature is not only of theoretical importance, but also very much in practice. And still, and unfortunately, anthropocentrism remains really dominant in modern civilization, and it kind of underpins our economic and social systems. So what does this have to do with space? Well, despite the fact that there is a history between environmentalism and space, such as the first photographs of Earth, they became iconic symbols in the environmental movement, and space science has been very important for climate change science and so on. But the space discourse, meaning the kind of story of space, space exploration and of humans in space that's been told, both through science fiction and in practice, bears strong legacy to anthropocentrism and related dominant ideologies of modern civilization. And this story typically paints a picture of a human destiny to explore and conquer space, of building new worlds in allegedly empty or dead worlds that are really kind of free for us to take, and of heroes going in the name of the public and so on. And for example, the idea that biological humans can detach from the rest of terrestrial nature and survive alone on other planets, that's ontological anthropocentrism. And the idea that humans are destined to conquer the universe and entitled to do so, that's ethical anthropocentrism. So these accounts of humans in space, they kind of rest on a historic legacy that connects deeply to American ideology and more broadly to colonialism and modern paradigms of capitalism. And this is especially the case now that it's really kind of the world's richest individuals that have to a large extent taken over the story. So this means that the space discourse, it further represents a value system, which very structure has depended on the exploitation of people and the planet, really for the benefit of a rather small and specific group, and which sees humans as distinctly separated from and superior to the rest of the natural world. So this is why there's a lot of environmental concern arising in response to the new space age. It's not because the space environment is the same as the Earth environment, but because of the track record of this framework of thought for non-humans and the natural environment, and its intrinsic link to also social injustice. So there's reason to consider this a rather poor starting point for how we may go about exploring and expanding our domain into outer space. And after all, space exploration in its very essence is future-oriented. It represents a frontier of human skills and knowledge and capacities. So in my opinion, we should expect space to be equally progressive also when it comes to ethics. And an important aspect of the new space age is exactly that it raises new ethical questions. Because now we're not only talking about scientific exploration anymore, but we're setting into life ideas of space resource extraction, settlements on Mars, and geoengineering projects such as terraforming, which is the process of kind of modifying the planets to make it habitable to Earth life. So this really intensifies the ethical debate surrounding what we might do in space. All right, so that was a bit of context as to the kind of environmental and ethical dimensions of the space discourse. Now let's take a closer look at some of the things that we might actually go about doing in space. And in my experience, many different ideas for what we might do in space, they tend to be kind of discussed and assessed in the same breath, when they in fact pertain to very different timescales. And I feel like this causes a lot of confusion, and it sort of diffuses the ethical questions that needs to be addressed. And it's also strange that this kind of mixing up of timescales occurs, because now we do have companies like SpaceX who talk about large-scale settlements and terraforming, or Jeff Bezos who's talking about lifting heavy industry off Earth and so on, as if such projects could be realized in one generation. So I'll try and go about it in a bit more systematic fashion. So if we start with the present, the kind of key issues right now that has environmental implications are space debris in the near Earth environment. We have both scientific and commercial missions to other celestial bodies, and particularly when they include landing of spacecrafts. We have commercial mega projects in the near Earth environment, such as SpaceX Starlink projects, and we have really the first stages of space tourism. So these activities raise a number of different ethical questions. For space debris, there are profound questions of responsibility and of how we can clean up the near Earth environment. And for missions involving contact with other celestial bodies, there's risk of planetary contamination, which means contaminating with terrestrial microorganisms, which could potentially interfere with any indigenous organisms, or the risk of bringing any extraterrestrial organisms back to Earth that could do harm here. But there are also planetary protection concerns that are not about life. For example, there's an organization called For All Moonkind, who works to protect cultural heritage sites on the moon from the historic moon landings. And when it comes to space tourism, one can say that there might be potential for greater awareness and action on environmental issues here on Earth from more people experiencing the overview effect, which is essentially a kind of cognitive paradigm shift following from seeing Earth from a distance. But then on the other hand, spaceflight also has major environmental impacts and is currently inaccessible really to the very rich and privileged. But another aspect of commercial spaceflight is that in the kind of big picture, it might also serve the purpose of being the first steps towards establishing a space infrastructure that can be of more long-term value for greater projects such as permanent settlements and safeguarding against risks here on Earth. And we'll get back to such considerations when we talk about the middle term. But an example that is more immediate is the Starlink project of SpaceX. And this is essentially a constellation of satellites that in effect encapsulates the planet. And the aim is to provide global internet access. But it has raised both scientific and aesthetic concerns about pollution of the night sky as seen from Earth. So this entails questions about the kind of value of the space environment, not with humans going into space, but as we experience it here from Earth, as part of our Earth environment. So in essence, most environmental ethics concerns of what is going on in space right now are kind of tied to current political and social dimensions on Earth and their effect on the natural environment here. So this entails a kind of concept of a space environment that is primarily an expansion of the Earth environment, including the moon being seen as a specific place in our historic recordings, but I think less so as a place of nature of its own. For example, from an environmental perspective, the items left on the moon can also be considered littering. But this is, in my experience, a less common perspective. All right, so near term, that's when we find sort of ideas that are brewing right now, which are planned to be set in motion soon. And that includes resource extraction, a permanent moon base, and sending the first humans to Mars. And the latter really also entails a possibility of first contact with any potential extraterrestrial life. So with these type of activities, we get ethical questions such as who benefits from space resource extraction. For example, there are arguments that such activities will aid environmental sustainability issues here on Earth, as well as related social issues such as global poverty. But then one can also argue that there's not much reason to expect resource accumulation by billion-dollar corporations to benefit humanity and or the environment in any kind of altruistic manner. And with space resources, it's also a question of whether they can be claimed by individuals and whether they belong to the present generation, or should they maybe rather be saved for future generations who could need them more. And while resource extraction is typically seen in terms of kind of economic value, more invasive activities and setting up more permanent bases on other celestial bodies, that actually raises questions about other types of value that can be present in these environments. So that can include aesthetic value. Many, for example, will hold that the moon and Mars are beautiful as they are, that although they are different from Earth, they are still kind of pristine places. Perhaps do they also have intrinsic value, so that these places have a kind of right to exist in their current form without our disturbance. After all, they do sort of have their own particular historic trajectory through space. Or if we turn it around, one can ask, do we really have the right to kind of make changes to other planets in our image? And another relevant consideration here is that invasive changes to places in space can also get in conflict with different cultures on Earth, where, for example, the moon is considered sacred. And when it comes to sending humans to Mars, there's actually a lot of opposition that sees this in light of our environmental history on Earth and its connection to colonialism, and therefore considers this a kind of invasion of a similar imperialist and environmental destructive form. But then others again criticizes drawing this parallel due to the fact that there's no indigenous population on Mars and there's no kind of living wilderness similar to what we have on Earth. However, sending humans to Mars does raise the very profound scenario of potentially encountering microbial life. And that raises the much debated question of the moral value of such life. And here opinions really range from Mars belonging to any Mars life, in other words, arguments that humans shouldn't disturb Mars in any way if we find life. Others argue that we don't give particular moral consideration to microbial life here on Earth, so why should we do it on Mars? And an important distinction here is something we call Originalism, namely whether such life should turn out to be of the same or a different origin from terrestrial life. Because a different origin would liken such a discovery to kind of the very phenomenon of life on Earth. And an alternative argument is to try and find a sort of compromise, or someone has proposed that we can establish planetary parks to kind of protect large areas on these planets while allowing humans to set up small habitats elsewhere on the planet. And an interesting aspect of these kind of first human steps on Mars is that this will initially take the form of a closed habitats, imitating in a very simple form the kind of Earth ecosystem. And this is interesting because it will actually demand from whoever partakes, kind of irrelevant to whether they are sent by governmental or commercial actors, and really exceptionally close attention to the functionality and delicacy of this ecosystem. So these first habitats will essentially be experiments in habitability and in extreme sustainability. And this has actually prompted some people to wonder whether these first habitats can be a sort of incubator of the hyper environmental ethic, which we also sorely need on Earth. And in addition, we should also kind of expect that these first Mars dwellers will develop conceptual relationships to their surrounding environments, perhaps similar to experiments that we have on Earth to certain wilderness areas that can be beautiful and dangerous at the same time. We could also expect them to develop completely unique environmental experiences in these places. So now we see that our conceptualization of the space environment starts to get more complex. Because now we have a concept of space environments as perhaps not living nature as we know it on Earth, but as abiotic nature, similar to mountains, for example, with aesthetic value and possibly even intrinsic value. I think many would probably see it as a loss of value if we were to kind of blow up Mount Everest. So how are we to think about mountains on other planets, for example? So perhaps it's the Mars environment, a form of wilderness. It's at least no longer only resources, but a place in which humans will take step and have experiences in the encounter with the environment. And should we encounter life, we might approach it through similar measures as environmental protection on Earth. All right, so that brings us to the middle term. It starts to get more interesting. It's hard to kind of project possible trajectories in space, but we're now looking at probably at least a few hundred years ahead. So that can involve large-scale settlements on other planets and large-scale geoengineering projects such as terraforming, and maybe at least underway. Of course, the realization of any trajectories this far into the future completely depends on how we have been able to handle things here on Earth. But now we actually get quite different environmental ethics questions. For the present and the near-term future, environmental ethics questions in space are to a large extent about expanding our environmental considerations to include the space environments as they are. Whereas in the case of actually creating new viable habitats, we're looking at also bringing with us a variety of other terrestrial beings and entities into these space environments. As I said earlier, humans can't just take off on our own. Our survival and well-being depend on healthy ecosystems in which we must live, at least as long as we remain biological beings. So one central question here is, and which of course reflects directly on our current state here on Earth, is the value of the rest of nature for human well-being and for our further potential. So while the very first habitats on other planets will be about mere survival, larger scale settlements should kind of aim higher and be constructed as environments that are healthy and enriching for humans to live in. So living on other planets is certainly not only a technical problem, it's also a qualitative problem. And I think that our kind of broken relationship to the rest of nature here on Earth is already causing us a lot of harm. So to pursue an even more sort of existentially lonely way of being human beyond Earth appears to me as not only exceptionally risky, but deeply undesirable. So if creating viable space habitats entails creating complex ecosystems inspired by Earth, then this means that we might actually face sort of moral dilemmas between respecting the space environments as they are versus disturbing them with terrestrial beings. And the other major question here then is whether we are to bring these other earthly beings only for their instrumental value to humans or for their own sake. And an important perspective here comes from global catastrophic risk as a sort of motivation for trying to pursue large-scale settlements in the first place. Because while unfolding any catastrophe on Earth won't necessarily entail a complete annihilation of life, it will likely entail mass extinction, the destruction of ecosystems, and it could leave human civilization in a state where we're not capable of pursuing space activities at all. So space expansion is therefore, kind of generally speaking, a viable risk mitigation strategy. By spreading beyond Earth, we would become more resilient to risk. And this is quite often used as an argument for sort of safeguarding the human species. But importantly, this actually applies to any and all Earth originating entities, not just humans. So in other words, any other beings or things that we think are of moral value could therefore also be worthy of being protected from catastrophic risk by taking them with us off Earth. And excuse me, importantly, this strategy of kind of creating space settlements as a form of risk mitigation relies on there being no or at least minimal risk correlation between the different locations. So for example, a Mars habitat that is completely dependent on Earth provisions is vulnerable if a catastrophe hits Earth, whereas a fully self-sustained habitat is much more resilient. So that's another reason to aim for really complex, sustainable ecosystems. And such considerations actually makes ideas like terraforming quite ethically complicated. Because on the one hand, it can of course be considered exceptionally invasive and hubristic to completely transform another planet in our own image. But on the other hand, if it is in the name of sort of creating viable environments to protect and preserve Earth life at large, then one can ask whether the sacrifice of, in this case, the Mars environment is morally acceptable. And this, of course, has implications even for what we do today, because this gives us another reason to work on mitigating risks on Earth, both to human civilization, because it's needed to pursue space expansion, and to other Earth life in order to preserve as large part of the ecosphere as possible for future expansion. So now we're looking at a conceptualization of space environments that sort of incorporate terrestrial nature, environments that humans and other life is to live in, possibly in hybridization with extraterrestrial nature. So this means space environments that are no longer really fundamentally different from the Earth environment, but more of a general expansion of not just the human species, but terrestrial life and nature beyond Earth. So in this scenario, humans born on Mars, they will develop relationships to that environment, similar as we have done on Earth, and likewise for other life forms. So from here, we can kind of slide over into long term, which can perhaps be considered to start from such large scale settlements and toward what sort of happens after that. So one important aspect of any long-term future in space is that it likely means that we have found a way to overcome or at least drastically minimize catastrophic risks. Having successfully created resilient and sustainable habitats in different locations across space, it means that we have gained an immense capacity to pursue goals relative to what we have at the present. And this may include applying enhancement technologies to humans and other beings to adapt to new environments and ways of living. Possibly we have gained the capacity to really transform planets in our image or construct megastructures, sort of artificial planets from scratch. So this is a time frame where biology and ecology as we know it on Earth may have developed significantly along technological trajectories, possibly even changing the very nature of evolution. Of course, it can easily become really mere speculation to think about environmental ethics questions so long into the future, because it could include humans or post-humans or other moral agents that have completely different moral views from what we have today. But one consideration that do have implications even for what we do today is that if we have overcome risks, then we are in a more kind of fortunate position being able to consider what moral values do we really want to sort of spread across the universe, given a capacity to do so. So in a way, the middle term scenario can be seen as having succeeded with the sustainability of civilization and Earth life. Whereas now we have kind of the opportunity for optimization, in other words, it's not only about making sure that things continue to exist, but making things be the best that it can be. And a reason why some more philosophers like myself and others pay particular attention to such long-term scenarios is by adhering to a principle of equality across time and space. And in essence, this means that someone or something of moral value is of the same value independent of the time in which it happens to exist and the location it happens to exist in. And this matters for space expansion because if we succeed, and by effect with mitigating the risks inherent in staying on Earth only, then we open up for an exceptionally larger kind of tempospatial scale that allows for really astronomical opportunities to pursue moral value. And these opportunities are much, much greater than those available for the present time and the near-term future, and in trajectories where we remain on Earth only. So therefore, from an environmental and non-anthropocentric perspective, pursuing such long-term space expansion might actually prove the equivalent of kind of keeping open the door to a multitude of possible futures, not only for humankind, but for all moral values inherent in the Earth ecosphere. Whereas not expanding into space would effectively close the door on all of them, at the latest when Earth becomes uninhabitable. So this means that if we think that other phenomena from Earth are of great moral value, such as other species or biodiversity, then we actually have reason to also consider these phenomena's long-term potential, which again can give us strong incentives to protect this phenomena now, so that they remain available to promote through space later. And for example, there are some people who argue that we are not really worthy of spreading in space based on our past behavior on Earth. And while that might be the case now, in the long-term perspective, space expansion, is the way I see it, it's not about one species as it currently happens to exist. It's about the kind of continuation and potentiality of the total story of life that came from Earth. So another way to look at it is that humankind actually has an important instrumental role on behalf of this greater story, in the sense that we are currently the ones capable of actively pursuing space expansion. So to kind of counter those environmentalists who argue that we're not worthy, I, for one, actually think that despite our past and present misconduct toward the rest of Earth's life, it would be even more immoral to kind of condemn all future life for what a few generations of one species have done. I think that if there's a possibility from continuing the story of terrestrial life into the far future by expanding into space, then it is actually deeply anti-environmental and deeply anthropocentric to deny the pursuit of this possibility. And building off such sort of potentiality of the Earth life story, another consideration is that if such long-term scenarios include advanced technological capacity, which they are likely to do, then we could also be looking at a future diversity of life forms that vastly exceeds the present and previous periods on Earth, by sort of merging technology and biology. And the potential of that diversity could depend on the original biodiversity pool available. So if you think, for example, that a diversity of life forms is of moral value, then one can ask, is there more value in the universe the more types of beings that exist? Does it matter whether these beings are biological or not? And if so, why? And finally, a third consideration is that it's quite possible that future humans or post-humans will be more and more morally evolved than we are today. And perhaps will they have stronger motivations to protect and promote a larger circle of entities than what many humans are motivated to do today. And if so, one can ask, should we today accommodate for such moral development by protecting an as large circle of beings and entities today so that they can be further valued and promoted into the future? Okay, so what conception of the space environment have we kind of ended up with here? I think that one way of looking at it is as not really expanding beyond Earth, but rather taking Earth with us and kind of multiplying it across space. Of course, in this time frame, what our descendants may call home and may call nature will probably be fundamentally different from present Earth. But at least such a universe, it could hold a multitude of rich and flourishing worlds, very different from the original Earth, but they could still all be part of this kind of greater cosmic story of life that came from Earth. And I, for one, like to think that such future worlds could be equally beautiful, equally extraordinary, but of course, their realization depends on a lot of choices we make from now until then. So I think that's what I have time for today. Maybe just repeat a few key takeaways, because we've covered a lot of ground here. First, we should aim for a narrative of the future that is an improvement of the present, not a repetition of past mistakes. And that includes approaching space environments with a sort of humility and respect that we have failed to show the Earth environment. But it can also include making difficult trade-offs between protecting and advancing terrestrial nature at the expense of extraterrestrial nature, and particularly in the light of catastrophic risks. And longer-term trajectories of what we could do in space is not about leaving Earth behind, but on the contrary, our space future matters for the total Earth life story. And humans have a unique instrumental role in the continuation of this story. I think it's important to not be kind of blinded by the visions of a few individuals who happen to live right now, because the long-term space horizon is so much bigger and is so much more important. And finally, thinking about our common space future actually gives us another incentive to act now to protect and preserve all that we have of value here on Earth, so that we can indeed have a long-term future. So thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me later. And if you're interested in these topics, I do encourage you to check out the digital space ethics library. There should be a link on the screen here, which I co-created. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was just absolutely brilliant. It's fascinating. If I could ask the rest of the panel to join me now, and we can discuss all of that. That would be excellent. And please do keep sending through your questions. We've got lots. I'm not, rather than doing a panel discussion and Q&A session, I'm gonna try and weave them all together as a relatively seamless thing. So send them through. So yeah, as kind of a discussion point to kind of get kick-started, one of the things I was thinking about throughout that presentation, and one of the things I think about in my own work, is kind of this question of, yes, space is an environment, but is it part of the environment? And do we separate, and then even then, do we think about separating what we mean? It might be reasonable to say that the Earth orbital environment is part of the Earth environment, or the Earth Moon system is part of the Earth environment. But what about Mars and the asteroids? And Chris, I know you sort of discussed this a bit, but I'll open the floor to anybody who wants to get started on that one.
Do you want me to kick off with some tentative thoughts? Because as a and this is the part where everybody sort of turns off, because I'm going to use those fateful words. As a lawyer, my thought turns to environment in terms of jurisdiction. It looks at what we can manage and what we can have control over and what we can actually conceptualize. So I think, I mean, one of the difficulties is, and one of the really interesting things about Andrea's talk, I agree with you, Thomas, I thought it was absolutely spellbinding. One of the things that I think that we're going to have to address going forward is exactly what we mean by this definition. We're going to have to pull in this definition. We've only just touching the surface of areas in such as, where does space begin? So, how we define celestial bodies, what type of characteristics these bodies will take that make them of interest to us and that don't make us of interest to us. I mean, from your own work in the Outer Space Treaty, essentially the jurisdiction is Earth, and then everything else is not Earth. And that's as far as we go. And maybe that's the environment that we're talking about here. So I think from a jurisdictional point of view, I think there are questions that we need to ask ourselves as a species. And I think this is one of the great advantages of having an event like this. We need to open up the discussion and get as many voices in as we can. Laws don't happen through, or laws shouldn't happen through imposition. Good laws don't happen through imposition. They happen through, an awareness and a coalescing of values. And that was one of the interesting things that, I think we need to bring into the discussion, our values as we move forward, because I think that is going to really help determine our definition of the environment as opposed to an environment, our jurisdictional scope in all of this. And I think why are we going out there? Why are we doing this? That will then help shape how we do this.
I think the point about why is quite core, and as Andrea I think helpfully demonstrated, particularly in talking about the longer term implications. If it is about saving humanity or saving life in general, then obviously that puts into sort of different balances. And I think that's an important point. And I would really like to hear both Nishant and Luke's thoughts on this kind of balancing act that we have to do between, yes, we want to make use of outer space, and we want to make use of things. I mean, you have the same thing with the terrestrial environment. We want to still make things out of iron ore, so we still need to dig iron ore out of the ground, but we recognize the damages that has. And I think we can see the same sort of issues in space. Starlink might be a great advantage for humanity, but it's an awful lot of potential space debris.
I can go ahead and start, if that's okay. Just really quickly for the attendees, just to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Luke Riesbeck. As Thomas mentioned up at the top, I work for a company called Astroscale. I work at the US subsidiary of that company. And Astroscale, we focus quite squarely within the near-term considerations that were mentioned in Andrew's talk. So we are developing a suite of different on-orbit services concentrated on the Earth orbit and maybe the cislunar environment out into the future. But for us, that work consists of the technologies themselves, business cases, and the policy elements around questions of orbital sustainability. So that focuses on things like the reduction and removal of orbital debris, but also ways to better make use and be more efficient in how we create value from the assets that are in space today or that are launching today. So being able to service and repair and upgrade assets in orbit is also something that is part of that sort of on-orbit services picture of what we work on. So for myself, this balancing act of recognizing the incredible value that is generated from assets that we put in space and trying to reorganize how that's done in a way that doesn't create long-term problems for future generations. That's basically the entirety of what we do at Astroscale. And it is tricky. I think one of the things that I wanted to address just from what you mentioned, Thomas, about specific new sort of models of space activities that we have right now, things like Starlink and commercial activity in space in general, both in Earth orbit and beyond. These are all activities that were really not 100% accounted for in initial conversations of how we should define what belongs to humanity and what doesn't in space. So, Chris, you mentioned the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, aside from the fact that there were many nations that were not party to that treaty at the time of its signature, even since then, it's something that within the sort of realm of international law, there isn't a seat at the table for, the actors that have grown to be more active in space than some governments, even the ones that were party to the original treaties. So really, what we're seeing is a recognition, I think, that there's a lot more people involved in these kinds of conversations. And even if, commercial activities that we're seeing now hadn't come about, even if it had remained kind of purely the purview of government activity, I think we would still be facing a bit of a reckoning of, who are these, space activities in Earth orbit in particular actually benefiting? How are they benefiting humanity? And is that benefit, is that value that's created something that's just or equitable in how it's distributed? So some of the original propositions for major commercial activities, I mean, things that come to mind are, the OneWeb and O3b concept are founded in, they are done by commercial companies. They are for-profit companies, but they are founded because, the mission of those activities is to, spread out that benefit to those who don't have access to it, for things like broadband internet access, which I think is, something that the past 2 years under COVID has definitely proven to be, very fundamental to, people's well-being, their ability to be connected in the modern world. So getting back to what I do at Astroscale, we are very aware of the value that is created by these new types of services. And so in trying to influence and provide options for those operators, whether they're government or commercial operators, the design for the environment, the design with the environment in mind, and getting operators and designers of space systems to stop thinking of space as something that's just a blank, endless void, and it doesn't really matter if trash is generated there, if debris is generated there, to start thinking about it as something more to be a steward of, rather than just to extract value from. That has been something that we have, seen a lot of progress in the past couple of years on. And as you mentioned at the top, Thomas, exacerbated by large debris creating incidents like the one we saw earlier this week. So, yeah, I think I'll end it there for that question. Thank you.
And Nishant, before I bring you in, just to, I think, given that your research focuses on South Asia, one of the issues that we see in dealing with space debris is a similar objection to the climate change issue, in that countries in the global south feel that some of these measures are preventing their fully taking advantage of the space environment, when we in the West have been able to build our infrastructure more or less without concerning of space debris. And so I think that definitely brings an important dimension to these discussions. But again, it is a problem that needs to be dealt with, much like greenhouse gases. So how exactly do we deal with that in our regulatory systems?
Thank you, Thomas. Absolutely. If you look at so what Andrea mentioned in a keynote as to the long-term, medium-term, short-term, how those goals go, or what Chris mentioned as to good laws are the ones which are built on a value consensus, and something Luke also mentioned, that there are actors, or when the Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated, there weren't certain entities which weren't actors, but now they're actors. That's something, I mean, if there are the point that comes out exactly from looking at the climate change discussions that happen, or for that matter, even biodiversity discussions that happen, that the global south in that sense was never an important player to that extent. And that's the thing that you see in the space law as well. And that brings us to the question as to what was the values that which we are looking at, say, the international environmental law regime. About 15 years ago, you would argue that nothing like international environmental law probably existed. It was just part of international law. But over time, your values change. You look at the fact that an anthropogenic viewpoint is not correct. there are other voices that come in, the global south voices come in, feminist voices, third world voices, etc. come in. And then you have these competing rise of countries like India and China, which is also happening in space, where if you look at anti-satellite weaponry that these countries are developing. That leads us to the question as to that if at all times humanity's values are changing, would our laws be compatible with it at that time, or would they continue to evolve, leading us to a situation where we would never even have a legal system that is fit for its own purpose to address the problems that we are looking at, whether that concerns, say, in my context, when I look at climate change, that we continue to have state parties negotiating, but suddenly we realize that maybe states aren't the entities that will govern climate change or address this problem. And therefore you have agreements like Paris Agreement, which allow subnational actors, non-state actors, and others to take part. Would that be the regime that space law will adopt, or space governance would adopt? Or would we continue to still look at sovereignty as an essential state party act, or would how? So the way I would the point that I would try to look at is that should we have lessons that we learn from the way international environmental law has grown or climate change law has grown when we look at space governance, or should we just disconnect it because there are larger issues at play, larger ethical boundaries that are at play?
I'm using again. That's an excellent question, and I think I'll sort of throw it back to Chris and Luke on this one, because space law in particular is perhaps more than in any other aspect of international law very heavily state-centric. With Article 6 not only making states responsible for activities of private organizations, but actually requiring continual authorization and continual supervision. So whilst we are seeing this proliferation of non-state actors, we do have a very state-centric governance regime. And I suppose the real question is that fit for the future? And I'll let you, either of you, answer that question first. You're muted, Chris.
I was just going to say I'll let my friend Luke talk. He's much more profound on this than myself, I think.
Sure. So I think, from our perspective as like current satellite operators, we are subject to the jurisdiction of the domestic country that we're in. We happen to be, a global company. We have different missions that are being licensed in different legal regimes. And there are sort of common questions, particularly because the activities that we're engaging in are not traditional activities. They're not just sort of a basic, like launching a rocket and that's it, or a standard, communication satellite or anything like that. The types of activities we're doing are a little bit new. And so within those domestic oversight regimes, each nation is going to essentially decide what they want to do. And the commercial actors that are registered in those nations and that are under that jurisdiction are bound to that. But we've, I think, in our observations at places like the United Nations and others, I think we have seen a little bit of an understanding that commercial actors are going to be, in the coming years, the owners of more assets in space than governments. And that will be the first time that happens. I mean, that is, if the planned structures, the planned constellations come to fruition that have been announced in the public, that will be a very different world from the one we operate in today. And tying it back a little bit to Andrea's keynote, you mentioned in this, within the near-term paradigm thing that, it's not that the space environment is the same thing as the human environment. And I think maybe not philosophically, but at least from an ethical and regulatory and licensing oversight perspective, I think that is something that there's a little bit more debate on right now, and that we're interested in seeing more research being done into, because the U.S. in particular has a very clear process for evaluating the environmental impact of commercial operations here on Earth terrestrially, right? And that's under the NEPA, the Environmental Protection Act. And there's an entire process for whenever terrestrial companies want to enact something and conduct operations, they have to prove that they are able to mitigate severe impacts. But the foundation of that, at least domestically, that obligation is because they're operating in human environments, and that their operations have that tie where they could pose risk to people. And so whether or not space counts as a human environment, at very least Earth orbit, seeing as we have had humans living there for 20 years now, whether or not space counts as a human environment, I think, at least from a legal perspective, could be the switch that starts to compel more of those international actors, even within their own domestic regulatory regimes, to hold operators to a higher standard in terms of their impact on the orbital environment. So again, I know this is all within the near term bucket of what we've been talking about. And to be honest, it's been really fascinating to hear you speak about the medium and long-term elements, because that's just, from our perspective, I think we are so embroiled in the near term. So yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if I really answered your question, Nishant. Sorry about that. I got off on a tangent a little, but we can hopefully start, go from there.
I mean, I can reply quickly. No, like I totally agree. I think that these, in terms of like how we conceptualize the environment, and like these are things that we'll have to kind of develop over time. And like what you're saying now makes sense for where we are right now. But I think it's also important to try to be a bit like beforehand here, because we're like kind of underlying theme of some of these issues, both in terms of space activities and these like mega corporations that are operating, and similar with climate change, is that we have problems and proposed solutions that are really of a scale that we're not really set up to deal with, like our governmental and law-wise, but also in terms of our ethical systems, are like we're not really prepared for these kinds of issues. Climate change is not something happening only now, it's an intergenerational problem. So we need to think about ethics that goes a little bit further than how we think about the environment right now and how we value the environment right now. And that's also why I pointed out things like, how will future humans value? Like maybe it's not our job to answer, but maybe we should at least think about it. And we see now that, the space near Earth environment is already cluttered in such a short time. So there's reason to, and like if that environment is needed for maybe generations that are actually very short into the future, then I think that should be reflected in also how we kind of go about the governance and law questions that are related to it.
Right. Where it's not just a focus on ensuring that current operations are sustainable, but that actually we're remediating the problem. We're actually leaving it better than we found it for future generations. Yeah, I think that's one of the considerations, again, just from our perspective as an operator and trying to facilitate operations to actually remediate the environment, which is not a very common operation for anybody to be doing. There are only a few active remediation missions that have been proposed. From our approach there, regardless of the utilization of space for those future generations, we sort of act as if our assumption is that we can't conceive of it, that their uses of space, maybe 50, 100, 150 years down the line, will be, we hope, much more efficient, much more equitable in terms of spreading out that value across humanity. And it may enable the sorts of grand visions of moving Earth industry off and things like that. But for now, we just have to act as if they will be able to utilize it much better than we can, and set in place the standards of sort of leave no trace philosophy and stewardship, so that way that environment is easily navigable and able to be utilized by them in a way that's not burdensome or costly. So that's kind of the vision that underlies a lot of our work.
I think like the longer term considerations, are, and that's certainly something that I try to do in my academic work. But it can get very difficult as a legal scholar, as Chris and Nishant will probably quite well understand, that one of the questions that often comes up is state creation in space. And if we're talking about something like 300 or 400 years from now, it's hard to conceive of what the international legal system would even be like 400 years ago. If as prescient as Hugo Grotius may have been, I think you'd still be quite astonished to see what international law looks like now. And so I will plead difficulty on the same extent. But you're right about the ethical considerations, because we don't want to close off doorways to our future generations because we didn't take these things into consideration. And I think that there are avenues in the Outer Space Treaty for that. But I suppose my frustration, and as this weekend's events have sort of demonstrated, and perhaps more importantly, the response to this weekend's events, we can have legal provisions such as Article 9, which says that states must take due regard for the corresponding interests of other state parties. But what do you do if other states ignore that? And then if no one utilizes the legal instruments that we already have to enforce the law that we do actually have, even if it is inadequate, what do we do? Do we just give up? Do we just despair? I suppose, Chris, give us some hope.
What we're wrestling with here is a number of different vectors that are pulling on the problem. We've got the problem of prediction. We can predict relatively well into the near future. As a species, we're reasonably good at that. We can see when, if we're standing at the edge of a cliff, we've got a number of choices that we can make, but my choice is going to be to take a step back because the options that lay before me are going to be quite unpleasant if I don't. But once we start getting into into much beyond the relatively near future, the rise of mega constellations, the rise of private billionaire operators, was that foreseen 15 years ago? Was it in the mainstream 15 years ago? I don't think it was. And so I think we've got the problem of trying to predict. So, okay, then what do we do? How does our legal system respond? Well, that's okay, because we've got a treaty of principles. We've got a base treaty of principles that we then cling on to. But what happens when those principles are tied into institutions that are a little decoupled from that activity? As we're seeing now, the decoupling of space activity from the state. Then we're working on a cross-jurisdictional canvas. So there's another pull on the problem that we've got. We're not just trying to solve one problem here. We're trying to solve about 5 or 6 independent legal problems in terms of, looking for a hierarchy in a horizontal legal system. How do we manage that? Well, it's quite clear that from the ASAT test, we don't. Or we don't at the minute. So how do we lay down a series of ideas and a series of governing principles that will take us forward so that prediction will not defeat the key principles? How do we manage across a canvas that's going to change from a multi-jurisdictional to potentially a multi-planetary canvas? And how do we take account of that third driver, the unforeseen development in technology? So the hope I'm going to give you is the very despair that we've got, because we can't predict too far in the future. We can't predict. So all we can do, back to Luke's point, all we can do is the best right now that we can do. And that best is to not appropriate. It's to use and explore space in the interests of all countries without discrimination. It's to adhere to international law. It's to not station nuclear weapons in outer space. Do you see where I'm going with this? We've got the principles there, and we now have to try and operationalize them. Does that give hope?
Yes, I think it will. Which actually nicely segues into one of the questions that I'm going to sort of summarize and direct towards Andrea and Nishant. And I'll let you decide who gets to answer it first. But I think, and part of, you touched on this in your presentation, Andrea, that these are, we're using terms like global and human an awful lot. Obviously these are big questions, and we could be talking about hundreds and thousands of years of future potential for these questions. So doesn't that therefore indicates that responses to them needs to be global and a broader base of humanity. I'm trying to think how quite to put this into a question, but I think the way that the structures and the institutions that we currently have are all set up is very grounded in this concept of a state. I think, but we are seeing the limitations of this. The Russians are saying that they made an assessment of the risk of this test on Saturday and decided that it was acceptable. The rest of the world seems to disagree with them, but under our current system, that they're the ones who make those decisions. I think we see the same thing with the COP. Everyone's was there representing their country. And there wasn't that kind of global situation. So how do we address global situations when we don't have a global forum?
Yeah, I've been asking myself that question many times. I think this that's a very big problem here in terms of, first of all the voices that just aren't part of the conversation at all, which has very much been the case with the kind of space discourse. So even like the kind of ethical or legal questions we are asking ourselves are still within like one quite particular framework, and there's a million others that aren't even considered. So for all of these issues, I think really working on establishing this, as you say, more like international forums, which we're working on with climate change, and it's not coming very well, but like there are attempts. Like the same needs to happen for space governance and space ethics to a much larger extent. I think that's starting to happen, but it's very much at the kind of first steps. But considering that the type of, as you say, like global and long-term issues that we're talking about here, I think we need like structural changes to the kind of problem-solving forums that are supposed to be working on it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to take part, but it has to be like a much better diversity represented in order to make sure that we actually think it through and get all the right questions in there. That's not an easy task at all, and I don't necessarily know how to go about it, but I totally agree that that's very much needed. I think that's another issue why there's a lot of concern with these kind of multi-billion private actors coming into the scene, because like those kind of actors tend to also act much faster than governmental actors, for example. Like it's especially with like tech industry, like it's going very, very, very quickly, and ethics is always like running behind, and this is always the case. And when we're talking about issues of this scale, with where the implications and potential consequences are so immense, then that's really concerning. So it's not like there's a lot of criticism of people like Elon Musk and so on. It's not really about specific people. It's just the kind of structure of the problem is very problematic because it's so difficult to approach it and try to find solutions. Yeah, it's not really an answer, but a quick reflection on it.
Thank you. And Nishant, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. I'm sure you have a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, so just actually taking from a little bit from what Chris mentioned, there was a thought that crossed my mind when he said that he will give us hope. There are the principles that are already there in the space law regime that would that we will look at when we design or govern ourselves in the future as humanity, looking at a larger environment, or I don't know if the word environment itself would exist in that sense. There are also principles from other laws that we could be looking at. For example, do we hold the planet now in trust? Again, intergenerational as well as intragenerational. So for example, the voice of those who did not land up in the space treaty negotiations, or the voice of those who did not result in, say, climate change negotiations and those treaties. So concepts like that, common but differentiated responsibility, or for that matter, even sustainable development, the most sort of talked about buzzword in the environmental field, whether this is something that would be governing our space development. Luke mentioned that, we are looking at some sort of sustainability in the long term, eventually, that kind of a thing. So there are principles that exist in other laws and they could be sort of adopted. But the problem primarily remains is that who's the actor who's being governed, and who are the actors who are currently being governed and who will be governed in the near future. Which states, from a state's point of view also, which states will suddenly become important is something which is extremely difficult to consider and predict. Everybody may want to have a space program in the near future. And how is that going to regulate if broadband internet becomes an important thing through space, or I don't know if weather modification becomes important. And that's where the gap in the law will never get addressed to a larger extent. But there are principles which exist within other laws and within space law, which if combined effectively could lead to a solution which might work in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to take another one of our questions, and please keep sending them in if you have any others. So I think this is probably mainly directed to Andrea, but others may have some views on this one too. Given all of the ethical minefield involved in potentially settling another planet, would we be better off building orbital habitats and essentially leaving planets alone?
Yes. I mean, that depends on who you ask. I personally, I do favor the kind of alternative idea of like constructing habitats from scratch. It's not that that's a scenario that doesn't have any kind of ethical questions, but yeah, you do get away from some of these like really kind of, oh, we're going to like take Mars and completely change it in our image. So and like another good thing about constructing habitats from scratch is that given that we have the capacity to do so, we would be able to kind of create much more utopian environments, so to speak. Like we could really design them from scratch and create really Earth-like environments, maybe with less effort than trying to create a planet that already has certain conditions and try and make it into Earth. So that can be an economic question and kind of resource question, but also it can also be a safety question. Like if we have sort of habitats that we would be able to move around, that can also be a benefit in terms of, in contrast to kind of staying on a planet. So yeah, like personally, I do favor that option. Yeah.
That's actually really interesting for me to hear, because I think for my own understanding anyway, again, in the near term, one of the biggest considerations from a like medical health and safety perspective of missions beyond the moon, like missions to Mars, crewed missions to Mars, is what happens to a human psychologically when the Earth falls out of sight, when the Earth is small enough along the horizon that they lose their sense of orientation, they lose their sense of where their home is. And I think, aside from the fact that Mars is radioactive and barren, and the atmosphere is not akin enough to ours to sustain life as we know it. Aside from those sort of obvious physical factors at play there, that's one of the the largest considerations from a mental emotional health of astronauts perspective. If/when crewed Martian missions happen, which I think I'm a little more personally skeptical of than others even others in the commercial space industry right now. When they happen, if they happen, it will be the first time that humans will have to live on a non-Earth system, in a non-Earth system for longer than just a few weeks. It will be years before they return home, even if their stay on a Martian surface is only a matter of a few weeks. The transit with the current capabilities we have now in terms of launch would still be very lengthy. So the questions of loneliness, isolation, those kinds of emotional factors that are present in that kind of a mission are a very serious, high priority consideration for the space agencies like NASA that are considering like how these missions could be designed, right? So, when it comes to that middle term, medium term, and long term structures where large swaths of humanity may be occupying, off-world structures, off-Earth structures, the idea of having that be something that is constructed in orbit or out in space as opposed to on the surface of a planetary body is actually really interesting, because psychologically humans kind of need that firm, solid ground to be on. So yeah, that's really interesting, that from an ethical perspective, the sort of design of our own structure in space may be preferable to, from a conservationist perspective, than transforming the surface of an existing planet. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Can I
also, yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, what was I going to say? First of all, like when I do think in that kind of first intermediate period of sending first humans to Mars and so on, like all those questions that you raised, like I don't think we can get away from them. Like the first humans going there, they are going to have a hard time, and they are going to struggle with a lot of psychological issues and so on, and that's maybe a sacrifice that has to be made, or that's something they need to be kind of prepared for. It's not going to be a pretty ride. But as you said, like in the long term, and like if we could construct these sort of habitats, as you say, like it's about, humans are part of nature. So if it's also about what is best for us, like what kind of environments do we want to be in? And I do think that actually in the longer term, we shouldn't be too kind of bound up in thinking about how the Earth is now, because if we are living on like multiple structures, then these humans or post-humans or whatever they are, they're going to consider home something else than Earth. Like so we can't think about it from our perspective here and now. But given that we have a choice in terms of which direction we choose, in terms of what kind of environments we want to create for ourselves, like that will also affect what humans will become. Like if we manage to survive on Mars and create habitats there, we will with time necessarily change also like physiologically. And that will be a different type of change than if we live in a different type of structure. So there are some kind of choices to be made in terms of what long-term, like we can't predict the long-term future, but there are different directions that we can go into, and they matters for our own well-being and for other entities' well-being as well.
To ask for one of the other questions, because this one's quite relevant given that we are AstrobiologyOU. I'm going to sort of adapt it as well. The question is about the the absence of life on planets and what that does to the value of these worlds if they don't have any life. But I also think you can kind of look at it sort of what you were touching on in your keynote, Andrea, this question of if the solar system or even the universe really is devoid of life, and this is something that people like Elon Musk often talk about, do we then have an obligation to spread life out into the solar system to expand the sum total, and not to get too bogged down in the questions of law, but I do think I do sort of wonder whether there are any sort of questions in that in regards to environmental law. I mean, and this ethical question of if we, how far does our duty to preserve Earth and Earth life really extend? And that's for anyone.
I don't know if we necessarily have a duty or an obligation. Like, that kind of depends on your ethical framework. But from a kind of terrestrial perspective, I think it's reasonable that we would have an interest in preserving ourselves and the story that we're part of as long as we can. And I think in a way it's going to be hard to try and stop that. Like that, I think that kind of innate drive of life is definitely not unique to humans. It's something that's going to be hard to stop, and maybe that's okay. And I think like a lot of environmental concern is in terms of space is coming from this, what I talked about, like we're coming in there and kind of taking over and doing our things. But in this kind of perspective of like filling the universe with life, we're still probably talking about, leaving most of space as it is. So it's not that we will like take over and disturb everything. Like these things can happen at the same time. Maybe we have a good enough reason, or like it's morally acceptable from our terrestrial perspective to pursue our long-term future in space, while still the rest of space will go on with its own history and whatever else is going on out there. So it's not necessarily this kind of either or scenarios that sometimes these conversations get caught up in.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you. No, I agree. That's one of the reasons why I really like that question, because the complexity of it is the excitement. Thank you. So this one I think is for Luke. Can you? This is from Timmy Obi. So can you please explain the logic that future humans will be more moral?
Yes, I think this was something that you mentioned, Andrea, in your talk. You talked about the possibility that in that long term, when there are, I think you said something along the lines of post-biological beings or something like that, which was such a cool phrase for me to hear and think about. But essentially the idea of encountering other, what we call intelligent life, that has entirely different perspectives from our own, and other moral values and ethical values than our own. And I mean, personally, considering the fact that even within our own species, the moral and ethical values of us are quite disparate at times, and that is reflected in our treatment of our various environments here on Earth and outside of Earth. We can't really assume that life that we encounter, non-human life that we encounter, will be inherently more moral or more ethically involved than our own. But it's a possibility. Maybe Andrea, did you want to touch back on that and expand a little on that?
Sure. So there are two different things here, right? Like one is encountering other, like extraterrestrial intelligent life, and the other is our own moral development. In terms of our own moral developments, like sure, we can't know for sure that future humans will be more moral than us now, but we do see a kind of tendency in human history to kind of expand our morality. At least when we look back, many examples of things that used to be completely morally acceptable, and today we see them as completely immoral and so on. So there's a general expectation that if you like, depends a bit on your view on what morality is, but there's a general expectation that we also do develop morally. In terms of encountering extraterrestrial intelligence, yeah, like it's hard to say. There are a lot of people who argue that they're likely to be more moral if they are astronomically older than us, which they are likely to be. But of course, that morality can be completely unrecognizable to us. Like they probably won't have human morality, but if they are significantly more advanced, then there are some reason to expect that they also have an advanced morality. We don't know, but whether that can be kind of understood by us, I mean, we would maybe be insects in comparison, you know, like that's very hard to say.
Right. You know, I think this is something that is explored a lot in fiction and space-related fiction and media, books, movies, you know, TV shows, things like that. And actually, something that I've noticed in, you know, fiction stories about space, as somebody working in the space industry now and learning much more about how those operations and the physics of human space exploration works as I've gotten older, I've noticed that a lot of them, in recent years anyway, have sort of taken for granted kind of a near apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic state of the Earth as a starting point. There's an assumption that, you know, we're starting from that space exploration is utilized as a last resort, or it's born out of sort of fear and failure on Earth as a starting point, as opposed to presenting a picture of a humanity that has grown more equitable, that has grown in our ability to be conservators and stewards of our own environment and take care of our environment and avoid climate catastrophe, right? Or mitigate it.
Star Trek's post-utopian future comes after a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but just mindful of our time, and
I'm so sorry.
It's excellent discussion. I can sit here for hours and listening to you guys talk. It's been absolutely brilliant. But I want to invite Andrea and then anybody else if they've got any final thoughts to wrap up on, and then I'll conclude our event.
I mean, I can end by commenting on the last thing you said, Luke. Like, certainly, I think, you know, ideally, we don't want space exploration or space expansion to be something happening after catastrophe on Earth. Also, as I think I kind of touched upon in my speech, that's very unlikely. Like, we certainly need to have certain things in order on Earth to even have the kind of technological capacity to pursue such projects. So it would be much more ideal if these kind of longer term trajectories can happen while, you know, Earth also remains preserved and beautiful, and the home planet not as something we have to flee from. And if that is the case, then honestly, I'm not very optimistic that we'll get very far.
Thank you. So just as I say, we're running out of time, so I'll wrap us up. But as I say, this has been absolutely brilliant. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope you have too. We hope you can see in the chat we do have a feedback form that we would love you to fill out, so that we can prove to the university higher ups that everyone enjoyed this, and then maybe think about some more. This is the last of this series of 3. But that doesn't mean that it will be the last of this Borders of Astrobiology concept ever to happen. So keep an eye out for any maybe in the future. As you can see, there's lots of fascinating work being done by some very brilliant people. So check out their Twitters, check out our institutional websites, and get involved in the conversation and the discussion. You know, the future will be what we make of it, and a bit like Christmas, it will be here before you know it. So thank you, everybody, and have a good evening, afternoon, or hopefully not morning.
Thank you so much.